I love fruit, but the more that I look at the research, the less convinced I am that it's the fiber in fruit that has the benefit when it comes down to belly fat or when it comes down to visceral fat. I'm becoming more and more convinced that it's other elements of the fruit, not the sugar, but really unique things. Because the literature is getting really, really strong when it comes down to the correlation between fruit and visceral fat in a very positive way. Who doesn't want to reduce their visceral fat? Like, it's one of the strongest metabolic links that we have between basically poor health and diet. Like, we know things that influence visceral fat, and we know that visceral fat is one of the strongest risk factors that you could have for cardiometabolic dysfunction and disease. Let's go ahead and understand this a little bit more about fruit. So there was a study that was published in BMC, probably about 6 months ago or so. And this was really interesting because basically what they found, I'm just going to abbreviate it really quick, is that a Mediterranean diet that had extra polyphenols in it compared to a regular Mediterranean diet ended up having a 14% reduction in visceral fat compared to a 6% reduction in visceral fat. Point is, a Mediterranean diet, tremendous for reducing visceral fat. A Mediterranean diet that had a little bit more green tea and some fruit and polyphenols, that had significantly more than double the impact on reducing visceral fat. Okay, now we know from other literature that visceral fat is strongly linked to cardiometabolic disease. But what polyphenols specifically? Well, in this study, what they found is that the polyphenols that were raised the most, that were correlated with reductions in visceral fat the most, were twofold. There were two. There was urolithin A, which I've talked about all the time, but then there was another one called hippuric acid. And this particular polyphenol is found in forest berries, namely like darker forest berries, but not things like necessarily blueberries, because blueberries are rich in anthocyanins, but we're talking about things like maybe, sounds kind of funny, but chokeberries, sounds kind of fun. And then also you've got raspberries, you've got wild strawberries, you've got black currants, and you've got blackberries, things like that, and the occasional wild blueberry. If you did a quick Google search, which I invite you to go do after this video, look up forest berries. Like, those are the kinds of berries you would want to consume. They're very high in hippuric acid, which had the strongest correlation by far with visceral fat reduction. The other one was urolithin A, and urolithin A you usually find from pomegranates, from some nuts, and from tea. Okay. Now, hippuric acid you're going to find in green tea as well, whereas urolithin A you might find in more black teas. So it's actually pretty good to drink both kinds of teas. What does this have to do with fruit? Most people look at fruit. This is what's kind of funny. They'll look at fruit and they'll say there's fructose in fruit, and fructose, I shouldn't say most people that are anti-fruit. They'll say fructose in fruit is going to contribute to visceral fat and fatty liver because the body cannot metabolize fructose the same way that it metabolizes regular sugar, so it stores easier. Okay, I get it. I totally get it. But we're not talking about high fructose corn syrup here. We're talking about fruit. And we're talking about a moderate amount of berries. We're not going to cause, the evidence is quite clear that the polyphenols in fruit could actually be strongly protective against visceral fat. But for a long time, we thought that fiber was one of the biggest positive attributes of fruit. But now when we look at the polyphenols in fruit, we realize these are what have the real potential. As a matter of fact, there's a study that was published in Diabetes, Metabolic Syndrome, and Obesity that took a look at urolithin A specifically from like pomegranates, and it found that just 2.5 grams of urolithin A in a supplement form stopped the formation of visceral fat that would have come as a result of an extremely high fat, high calorie diet. So when subjects went high fat, high calorie, they did not gain visceral fat when urolithin A was in the equation. My point in saying this is not to say go out and buy a bunch of urolithin A. By the way, it is good stuff, but that's not the point here. The point is the polyphenols are cardiometabolic protective. The fiber could be doing something, but I don't think the fiber is the part of the fruit that we're interested in. Here's what's interesting. Polyphenols are somewhat of a fiber. They don't count towards much fiber when you look at, say, the overall grams, but they are a prebiotic fiber. So polyphenols act as sort of a fermenting, almost starter kit within your gut. But in addition to that, they also act as a shield from some of the gram-negative, highly inflammatory bacteria, and they protect against the lipopolysaccharides that are hugely inflammatory. So what's going on is these prebiotic polyphenols that we get from fruit are going into the gut, And they are encouraging very positive, tremendously good gut health, all while protecting against the bad stuff. And here's where it gets really interesting. There are only 2 species of bacteria in our gut that are associated with our weight or BMI. Okay, there are 16 strains that are associated with visceral fat. So we know there is a tremendous connection between our gut and visceral fat. We also know there is a beyond extreme correlation between polyphenols and our gut health. So interesting when you look at this BMC study and you see, okay, the more polyphenols they take in, the more of these certain polyphenols we see in the bloodstream, the more of these certain polyphenols we see in the bloodstream are associated with good gut health, and the better gut health and polyphenols we see, the lower visceral fat we see, dramatically. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. So the best thing that I could do for you is tell you what you should be looking at doing. Okay, to optimize gut health for this, when it comes down to fruit, you want to choose the fruits that are going to have the most bang for the buck when it comes down to polyphenols. So that means you do want to choose the darker berries whenever possible. You want to go for the blueberries, but you want to go for the wild blueberries, not the giant ones that are the size of a tomato. You want to go for the little teeny ones that are sweet and pack a good little punch. Then you want to go for the raspberries. You don't want the massive raspberries that, look like someone's swollen thumb or something. You want the little teeny ones, the ones that are organic. Better yet, the ones that you can pick, right? Same thing with blackberries. You don't want the blackberries that are the size of a plum that taste like an apple. You want to go for the nice little sweet ones, the little teeny guys. Same with black currants. Now, another thing that you can do independent of fruit, like they saw in this BMC study, they had them consume 3 to 4 cups of green tea per day. You can consume green tea and get a lot of the hippuric acid that you could get from fruit. So if you're trying to reduce your carbohydrate intake, have a couple glasses of green tea and feel free to have the caffeine-free green tea. Because in this case, we're not looking at the caffeine as a benefit. We're looking at the polyphenols. Hugely beneficial there. When it comes to urolithin A, you can consume pomegranates, walnuts, things like that. The downside is only 40% of the population can actually extract urolithin A from a pomegranate. So the same thing with hippuric acid. It looks like this. If you were to consume a pomegranate or you were to consume black currants, what would happen is they would metabolize in the gut. And as a result of the metabolism in the gut, you are left with what is called a postbiotic. In this case, hippuric acid or urolithin A. Now, to varying degrees, this is going to happen in different people. So these polyphenols or these compounds are created and liberated more if you're good at metabolizing the polyphenols in the first place. So it's very hard to tell. So in the case of urolithin A, I generally do recommend people supplement it. I think it makes some sense because it adds up. Urolithin A is a powerful compound that we've seen in scientific literature to work really well also. I went ahead, I put a link down below for a company called Timeline Nutrition. Probably the best urolithin A. Actually, I would get behind it and say it is the best urolithin A that's out there on the market because they have a patented technology called MitoPure. They have studies published in JAMA. They have all kinds of studies coming out time after time after time after time. So really good scientific literature to back them up. The other thing is when you look at urolithin A, huge effects on the mitochondria directly. So with like hippuric acid, we're looking at this stuff and we're saying, oh, maybe it's just a proxy for good gut health. Like maybe if someone has good gut health, they have high levels of hippuric acid. Urolithin A, we see direct mechanistic evidence that urolithin A is affecting the mitochondria and the metabolism. So it's less about the gut with urolithin A than it could be with maybe hippuric acid. So urolithin A supplementation does make actual sense. The link down below, Thomas 10, is a 10% off discount link. So again, that link is in the top line of the description. Highly, highly recommend it. It's something that I do think most people, especially people that are maybe north of 35, should probably add into their diet based upon what we're looking at here with the literature. So does the fiber in fruit actually have any real impact on visceral fat? Most of the literature with fiber in visceral fat is indirect. So we don't really know if fiber is impacting visceral fat. What we do know is that fiber seems to decrease weight. Now, does that mean that you're going to lose visceral fat? A lot of times, yes. But here's where things get really interesting. If we go back again to that BMC study, it's kind of interesting because subjects that were on the standard diet. There were 3 arms to this study: standard diet, Mediterranean, optimized Mediterranean. The standard diet group didn't lose any weight, but they did lose visceral fat. So it's like they could have actually gained subcutaneous fat and lost visceral fat. And remember, the one study, the one arm, actually ended up losing a fair bit of weight and a fair bit of visceral fat. Bottom line is what I'm saying here, is that we don't lose visceral fat at the same rate that we lose regular fat. Sometimes we lose it at a slower rate, and sometimes we lose it at a significantly faster rate. Because it is so metabolically ingrained, it is so close to our metabolic function, our mitochondrial function, our metabolic health. It almost operates on a different axis than just BMI and weight. It's like we have a survival mechanism that's on this side saying, you need to weigh this, have this amount of fat, you need to do this for survival. Then we have visceral fat, which almost is protective against us going septic. I mean, that's a completely different thing. It's the only real reason that visceral fat is there, is to prevent and protect a certain level of bacteria that crosses through the gut. So we're supposed to have a tiny bit, but having high levels of visceral fat, I would argue, is a very new thing. This is not something that our ancestors would have dealt with. It's just not, because we didn't have a surplus of fuel, and we definitely didn't have the metabolic dysfunction to the degree that we have it now. So the fruit that you want to be consuming, as long as you're not consuming 300 grams of fructose, and you're consuming fruit in the fashion that our ancestors would have, you're putting yourself in the perfect spot to combat visceral fat. And you're putting yourself in a perfect spot to probably reduce your food intake simply by a little bit of fiber. So yes, you'll probably lose regular belly fat, you'll probably lose regular weight, and you'll probably lose visceral fat. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.